Good morning. As has been indicated, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, but a summary of my presentation has already been availed to the organizers, and it will be availed to you later in the day. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this conference for inviting you to share my thoughts on a subject that I think is very topical: how Africa can harmonize our resources in order to move from what is described as the third world to the first world. In order to deal with that subject in a comprehensive manner, I think it is critical that we have an appreciation of the history of Africa, and to remind ourselves that although we ordinarily refer to Africa as if it was one homogeneous whole, Africa comprises of 54, or if you may, perhaps 55 artificially carved out countries. These countries have different history. There are those which were colonized by the British, and you know which ones they are, and the tradition that they inherited, whether it is in the legal arena or in the economic arena. There are those which were colonized by the French, and you know that they still carry and labor under the burden of the neo-colonial structures of the colonizers. You know that there are those which were colonized by the Portuguese, and you know and appreciate that they still labor under the burden of that colonization. You know that there are those which were subjected to the unilateral declaration of Ian Smith in Zimbabwe, and you know that they still labor under that burden. You know that there are those which were subjected to apartheid, and it is only until 25 years ago that they liberated themselves from the shackles of apartheid. You know that there was one little country that was colonized by the Spaniards. You know that there is another country that was colonized by the Belgians, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi. You know the history of Africa. Having appreciated the history of Africa in that sense, you must also remind yourselves that the post-colonial African state is in many ways still not yet free, and that even you who are here are not yet truly free. You are not free because in your unguarded moments sometimes, because of the education system that we continue to have, you still think that when you attend the University of Oxford rather than the Malawi University, then superior. You still think that if you are a chartered accountant who is qualified in the United Kingdom, then you are better than local qualification. And you mention it a lot more loudly. You are still not free because when you attend a conference in New York, you include it in your curriculum vitae, but when you attend one in Nairobi, Kenya, you don't. There is a sense in which we ourselves are laboring under those vestiges of colonialism. And there is a sense in which even our economies are still laboring under those weights. There is a sense even here in Malawi, as it is in many African countries, that 54 years after independence, and I mean this in the best of senses, when you talk about the four largest firms, it is Deloitte, it is PwC, It is Ernest and Young. It is KPMG, not Mwalupembe and Associates. In other words, our continent continues to suffer in very many ways. And that is why at the very beginning of the history of this continent, what happened is that those who were the founding fathers had a sense of urgency. They had a sense of urgency. If you look at some of the works of people like Nyerere, the works of people like Nkrumah, the works of people like Keita, the works of people like Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya and many others, including to a certain extent your own Kamuzu Hastings Banda. They had this recognition and realization that Africa had to unite and unite very quickly to begin to define her agenda. Indeed, the very first meeting in the month of May 1963, Nkrumah had this sense of urgency. We must have one country. We must have one unified agenda before we get used to our little sovereignties, which we are now used to. They were clear that we had to use our resources for our benefit. They were clear that we had to feed our people. They were clear that we had to deal with the enemies that were then extant: poverty, ignorance, and disease. But I have to report to you, unfortunately, that 50 years plus after independence, poverty is alive and well in Africa. I have to report to you, unfortunately, that 50 years plus after we gained independence, disease is alive and well. We still die because of diarrhea. We still die because of malnutrition. We may have made certain changes. We may have realized certain gains. But I can report to you that we are not in a very good state. I can report to you that we have many more schools and many more universities. But many of us have not had our minds liberated through this education. When you hear some of us who have gone to school arguing, we feel pain because the things they say and the things they do are inimical to the well-being not only of their countries but the continent. Africa has a lot to cover. That is not to say that we have not made gains. We have. But our steps are only baby steps. And that is why, therefore, in a forum such as this, we've got to ask ourselves painful questions as we look to the future. When African leaders met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in the year 2013, and they realized that we had not gained what we promised ourselves, they realized that we have a population of anything between 1 billion to 1.3 billion. They realized that we were not feeding ourselves. They realized that our roads were not as good as they should be. They realized that our GDP, the total GDP of the African continent combined, was still less than $2 trillion, smaller than the economy of Russia or Brazil. They realized that we were punching and are still punching below our political and economic weight. They came up with Africa Agenda 2063. And we made to ourselves certain promises under Agenda 2063. We said that we want an Africa that is prosperous. And that is a good thing to want prosperity. We said that we wanted an Africa that is integrated, that looks at things from a Pan-African perspective with the idea of African Renaissance as the linchpin. We said that we wanted an Africa where democracy was alive and well and human rights were expected. We said that we wanted a peaceful Africa. We said that we wanted an Africa which has ethics and has traditions and values that are African. We said that we wanted an Africa where women and youth were at the center of our development. We said that we wanted an Africa that could play at the center of the world, an Africa that was strong. Those were the 7 promises and 7 aspirations that we underlined under Africa Agenda 2063. And I remember then the then chairperson of the AU Council, Nkosan Dlamini Zuma, writing an imaginary letter to Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and saying, we know what you people were thinking about, but we hope that by the year 2063, Africa will be a middle-level economy. That Africa will have railway lines running from Addis Ababa to Dakar, from Cape Town to Tunis in Tunisia, and that possibly Malawi in the heart of Africa will be the hub of tourism and our continental fish will be Jambo. We said many things. It was informed by the realization that Africa must now rise up and begin to look at our resources in a manner that will benefit the continent. One may think that those were mere theories and that is not important, but I want to remind us that if we don't take care of those fundamentals, Africa will pay the price. Many Africans have now agonized over the state of Africa and posed fundamental questions. What is it that we can and must do if Africa is to rise and to play a role in the world? Some of the most recent writings, perhaps not so recent, but as recent as the year 2010, the South African writer Greg Mills, in a book which I commend to you, poses the question or states why Africa is poor and what Africa can do about it. And in that book, Greg Mills argues that poverty is a choice and that Africans, through their leaders, have made the decision to be poor. And he also said, citing a statement made by a lady who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, that part of the problem in Africa is that in many African countries we want things that require effort, but we don't want to make the effort. You may disagree with that kind of assessment, but the truth is Africa is becoming poorer and poorer in real terms by the day. When you see what are described as xenophobic attacks in South Africa, it is informed by poverty of the mind and poverty of material things. It is the belief by downgraded people who are under the table, that the crumbs under the table is what constitutes the whole meal, while the big dinner is actually happening on the top of the table. And I'm submitting to us that we must liberate ourselves, including you professionals, from the belief that there is these things that will happen without efforts on our part. And I'm saying we must ask ourselves, what are the resources available to us going forward so that we are able to fight and liberate ourselves in critical ways in a manner that I will demonstrate. Writing in the year 2010, the late Callistus Juma of Kenya, in a book which all of us ought to have read, The New Harvest, Callistus Juma says that if we cannot feed ourselves as Africans, then we cannot play a critical part in the affairs of the world. Feeding yourselves, I do not know, we are normally told that we have 5 senses, and we have all those 5 senses. But there is another 6th sense, which is satisfying yourself if you have not eaten. Even when you are here, you are given breaks. The reason why you are given breaks, notwithstanding that you are accountants, You are only accountants when you have fed yourselves. If you have not been fed, your accountancy knowledge disappears and you become animals who are only seeking one thing: to eat. And that is why feeding, the ability to feed ourselves, is critical. And Calestas Juma in the New Harvest is telling us that time has come that we must harness technology. Even if you want to be spiritual about it, in those early days, God said, "Go ye and subdue the world." In Africa, we have allowed the world to subdue us. And we are saying that we cannot continue to practice agriculture the way it was practiced by our forefathers. We cannot continue to use the plow. We cannot continue to do that while people are already employing nanotechnology in agriculture, giving crops only the water that it needs. We cannot continue to wait for God or to wait for Godot to come and give us all the things that we need. We must, in the nature of things, employ modern technology. The Israelis have done it, and other people are doing it. Why do we look at the world and say, "Oh, it has not rained this season, therefore our crops have failed"? God gave us the intelligence to do it, and Calestas Jumas in the New Harvest is telling us we must do it in order to be able to feed us. It's sad that today in a number of African countries we are importing fish from China. From China. Who knows how they feed the fish? We are importing rice from China. Who knows how they grow the rice? We are importing eggs from Romania. Who knows how their chicken are fed? Tell me, perhaps here in Malawi your chicken went on strike and they no longer lay eggs. Tell me. I'm submitting to all of us that agriculture must be one of the areas in which we focus so that Africa can realize our potential. The assumption that we can continue to receive aid from different parts of the world and that we will become prosperous is completely misguided. The young Zambian writer Dambisa Moyo, who writes on these things, has written a book, Dead Aid. And she says, she was writing in the year 2010, saying that by that time, Africa had received an inflow of $1 trillion or thereabouts, but there was nothing to show for it. You cannot, and I've said this before and I'm repeating it, he or she who is milking a borrowed cow can never be comfortable, because the owner will come when you are addicted to milk. And what do? So my own submission is we must have our own cows. We must harness our own resources, and we can and we must do it. Writing in the year 2017 in a book which I'm reading, which I find very fascinating, Greg Mills, Jeffrey Hubbs, and Olusegun Obasanjo have a book they have written called Making Africa Work. They are recognizing that Africa can actually work. And Africa has worked before. And it is you who are gathered here, who are professionals and others in different parts of the world, that can make Africa work. I remember not so long ago when your former president who worked with the World Bank, Mbingu wa Mutharika, became the president. And he came in with very good ideas about dealing with the question of the shortage of maize. And within a short time, there was surplus maize here in Malawi. There was. And countries imported maize from Malawi. The soil did not change. President Mbingu wa Mutharika did not come with an army of angels to introduce angelic agriculture. It is the same people, it is the same land. What you did is that he simply presided over the implementation of policies that already existed. It can be done, and it must be done. Because if it is not done, we are done. And you know, one of the things that is very important to recognize is that if we don't attend to these things, there are consequences that we face. In a book written in 2018 by Dambisa Moyo called The Edge of Chaos, she says that it is now quite obvious that liberal democracies are in danger because we have young people without opportunities, and if we have young people without opportunities, then they can very easily degenerate into violence. In the book that I talked about, written by Obasanjo, Greg Mills, and Jeffrey Hubbs, they actually recognize that by the year 2045, the population of Africa will be 2 billion and 50% will be living in urban areas. When people will be living in urban areas, there will be pressure on sanitation. There will be pressure on water. There will be pressure on food. The diminished opportunities will have moved into the fourth industrial revolution, which is already being embraced by others. A job that required 20 employees will now be undertaken by one robot. And the truth, therefore, is that if we don't focus on these things, we will be quarreling about water. As I speak to you now, there is already a conflict which is beginning to fester between Egypt and Ethiopia about only yesterday, the 20th of September 2019, Egyptians are telling the Ethiopians to control them so that we are able to determine what amount of water is released into the Nile. And the Ethiopians are saying, this is our water, we are going to generate 6,000 megawatts of electricity, and we don't accept it. The next wars that will be fought will be about water and about food. And I'm saying this because in the last 30 years, if you go to the Sahelian region, Lake Chad has shrunk by 80%. 80%, which means that those who are fishing in those areas can no longer fish. You therefore can understand why that Sahelian area has now become a fertile ground for recruiting people who join Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda. And you can understand, therefore, while there is no peace in Burkina Faso, you can understand why there is unrest in Chad. You can understand why there is no peace in Niger, why there is no peace and quiet in Nigeria, why there is no peace in Mali and Mauritania. You can understand. You can understand why there is discomfort in Tunisia. You can understand why there is discomfort in Sudan and in South Sudan. These are the critical issues that we must worry. You may say, but no, we are accountants in Malawi. We are landlocked. By the time that this arrives on us, Jesus will have come if you are Christian. And you will be in heaven. Who tells you Jesus is coming tomorrow? Because in God years, 1,000 years could be one day. Or we don't know. But even if he came, there is a sense in which we'll still need water. There is a sense in which we'll still need to live. These are the resources that we are talking about. And I'm submitting, therefore, that going forward, Africa must begin to reorient. You know, when I read Lee Kuan Yew, from third world to first world, the divorce between Malaysia and Singapore was not a velvet divorce. It was painful. One partner wanted to remain in the marriage. Singapore did not want to leave. But the other partner said, you leave. Malaysia may have thought that they were writing the obituary of Singapore. Little did they know that they were writing the foreword for Singapore. Several years down the line, without resources except the most important resource on earth, human resource, because that is the most important resource on earth. The country reoriented herself. Today, one of the biggest and busiest ports in the world is Singapore. Today, one of the countries that is moving towards shortage of labor, that they have no people to work, shortage of labor. If you say that in Africa, they'll say you are telling us cock and bull stories. In Singapore, they have shortage of labor and they import labor, human resource. How did they do it? They identified what was in their best interest and leveraged on their strengths. Today, Singapore per capita is at the highest. If you look at many African countries, our per capita income, if it is over $1,000, then we celebrate with song and dance. But even when we celebrate, one African politician what ought to be owned by 100 Africans, so that the per capita income is deceptive. The question is, if Singapore did it, how can we do it? And why must we not do it? And what are our resources? Africa is the richest continent on earth and has always been. In the last 2 weeks, I've read 2 books. One is written by Ambassador Kahende of Kenya. It's about David Livingstone, the vagabond explorer. And he talks about the young David Livingstone, a Scottish explorer, coming into these parts of the world and even naming your own former capital after a Scottish city, Blantyre. He goes into Zimbabwe and finds the Mosi-oa-Tunya Falls and says that Mosi-oa-Tunya is too difficult for the tongue, and he says Victoria Falls, and you and me now say very fondly, I'm going to Vic Falls. Not Mosi-oa-Tunya. And another young explorer called Speak goes to East Africa and finds another big lake which you who speak the Chichewa would call Nyanja, and he calls it Victoria, Lake Victoria. And here we are saying Victoria, Lake Victoria, not Lake Nyanja. Why did they come to Africa? Why did they come to the Monomotapa Empire? Because Africa had resources. Gold, diamond. The animals were here. Some even say, if they want to romanticize, that if the Garden of Eden must have been here, and I suspect it was. They saw the rivers, the Zambezi, the Limpopo, the Congo, the Nile, the Niger. Livingstone came. Then I read another book, Oporto, written by the Sierra Leone Creole Deckerson Thomas. He says how 500 years ago the Portuguese went to Sierra Leone and Liberia and the Gambia, and how they created conflicts among the tribes in that area, the En, the Mende, the Temne. But even before that, how the Arabs came in the eastern coast of Africa. in Zanzibar and in Pemba, and how they came to Sofala down in Mozambique. What is it that brings people to Africa? Have you ever asked that question? There must be something about Africa. Even before the birth of Christ, for those of you who are spiritually inclined, Pythagoras was here learning mathematics. And not only Pythagoras, Alexander the Great was here, and the whole city is named after him, Alexandria. Socrates was here. What brings people to Africa? Even when they wanted to kill Jesus, they say, hide him in Africa. And even when the Qurayshis were attacking the Prophet Muhammad, it is to Kush that he came in Africa. What brings people to Africa? How is it that Europeans in 1884 and 1885 for a whole year sat down in Berlin and said, we must divide this continent called Africa? They were not dividing America. No, they were not. They were not dividing Latin America. No, they were not. They were not dividing Asia. They were dividing Africa. What is it that is in Africa? You only divide that which is useful. Because that is how we divide cakes at weddings, because it is useful. There must be something in Africa. Everybody sees it, except us sometimes. And I know what is in Africa. First it was us, the men, who would provide labor. For that reason, they took away half of the population of Africa, 15 million, to the rest of the world. America is America because of Africa. When you go to the London Underground and you say, I'm in the tube, always remember that your ancestors were there. They took us, they enslaved us. And when they had used our labor after the end of the agricultural revolution, they came now, they were not satisfied because this land was too beautiful to be looked at from afar. They now came and colonized us. They now came and lived with us. What is so beautiful about Africa that if you can't control it from afar, you come and live in our very heart? What is it? I know what it is, but I'll talk about that a little later. When they had colonized us and we were agitated, and they dropped the thing called colonization, unknown to us, they brought another thing called neo-colonization. That is controlling our minds. That is why, unfortunately, even here as I speak to you, I speak in a foreign tongue. How I wish I was speaking in Chichewa. How I wish I was speaking in Kiswahili. How I wish I was speaking in Yoruba. How I wish I was speaking in Igbo. No. They left us the education system so that we are accountants, a good thing. Because the African state, the modern African state, is also a neo-colonial structure. LLB, London. We go to school, all of us, as I said a little earlier, but as my kinsman and my countryman, rather than my kinsman, Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, until the day that we decolonize our minds, we are going nowhere. I'm still talking about harmonizing our resource, because the greatest resource is the mind, the man whose portrait you've put there, once said, quoting James Lowell, he said, truth forever on the scaffold, forever on the crown, but that scaffold sways the future, but behind the dim unknown standeth God. There is a sense in which the mind is the standard of the man, and that is why I'm talking about us and our education. Dear accountants, qualified in Malawi, some chartered in the United Kingdom, and proud about it. Have we decolonized our minds? Have you ever had a person, including us, coming to Mangochi in this beautiful place, and when they see the beauty of Lake Malawi, in their unguarded moment they say, this does not look like Malawi? Have you ever heard that? How is Malawi supposed to look like? You come to Mangochi and you see the beautiful sun, and then somebody says, you look at this, you think you are in New York. Why? And you are in Malawi. Decolonize our minds. In a book written in the early 60s by Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o, The River Between, one of his characters, Wayaki, he goes out to acquire what he called the white man's education, and he tells him, go out there, learn the white man's ways, but never lose yourself. We have acquired education which is good, because all education, if used correctly, is good. But how are we using that education? I'm suggesting to us that if we want to harness African resources for our future, the first thing that we must harness is our consciousness and our intellect. And we must believe that we are not children of a lesser God. If Africa is to be great, our men and women must believe that they are capable of being great, because they are great. The Malawian must believe that they are capable of being great. The Malawian accountant must believe that they are capable of solving every accounting problem that there is in the world. And the Malawians must not believe that this is too complex. Now let us invite another accountant from the UK. Even our government sometimes argue this is too complex. We've got to do an international tender. An international tender means that you are going to bring somebody from outside Malawi and outside Africa to tell us the problems of Africa. Would India do that? Would China do that? Would the United States of America do that? Why is it that we do that? The first thing that we must do is to change our minds. And we must do it, and the sooner we do it, the better. You know, there is nothing wrong with the land in Africa. There is nothing wrong with our land. In fact, our land is the best. It is our mind, that is where the problems are. So if you thought I would tell you, let us open our minds so that Africa can be great, I will disappoint you. It is the mind that we must work on. Because if we talk about natural resources, sometimes I sit alone, or when I'm walking alone, I ask myself, God, and I imagine to myself, When God was sitting upstairs on the year dot, when the world was being created in the year dot, and they were looking at Africa, they must have said, this continent that is so centrally placed, because we are the most central of all continents, with the Tropic of Cancer and the Capricorn and Equator, with such a balanced weather, God must have said, let us hide all the minerals. I think it was hiding. So when you go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, look at what is hidden under her belly. All the minerals that you use to make your mobile phone, the essential ingredient, coltan, rare earth, the country that has the largest deposits on earth is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Tell me, I'm a visitor. Does Malawi make a mobile phone? No. And I can report to you, having traveled across Africa, no other African country makes a mobile phone, yet the essential ingredient for making mobile phone, the deposits are here in Africa. And God did not stop there. He once again, let us put the gold in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Let us put gold in Gold Coast in Ghana. Let us put gold in Nigeria. Let us put gold in the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. And yet when we are trading gold, do we trade gold in Ghana? No. Gold is traded in London and diamond is traded in Amsterdam, where there is not a single diamond. And God did not stop there. They said that they need to eat something called cocoa, and he went to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and put all the cocoa in the world. But until only very recently, you and me, when we want to take good chocolate, we are looking at Lady Godiva. All the chocolate is made in Belgium and in Switzerland. And when you buy somebody Swiss chocolate, when you travel, they tell you, when you are at Amsterdam waiting to connect to Malawi, they tell you, oh, don't forget to buy me chocolate. We who have gone to school, who have taste for chocolate. You can see our resources. All here. Look at the rivers. As a young pastor, we used to sing in school, the river Congo is not navigable, but the Limpopo, the Zambezi, and the Niger are navigable. Suppose we were to make all our rivers navigable, and they are navigable to a certain extent, I would be taking a boat from Zimbabwe to Tanzania and the entire SADC region. Today, if you want to fly from Lilongwe and go to Nairobi, you pay over $1,200 and you pay $800 to travel to New York. You wonder why Africans don't travel? They can't afford it. I'm saying all these because I hold the view that we have the capacity to harness all our resources. Look at electricity. The Congo River, harnessed, can produce enough electricity to light the entire continent of Africa. The installed capacity of electricity in Africa is less than the installed electricity in the continent of the United States of America. Here in Malawi, if you have 1,000 megawatts, you would be celebrating, and your politicians would possibly be, elect us again, elect us again. Iran produces more electricity than the entire sub-Saharan Africa combined, excluding South Africa. South Africa produces more electricity than the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. You talk about industrialization. You cannot industrialize when the power you have is no more, figuratively speaking, than the power that is generated by a candle. You can write about industrialization, but I'll not take you seriously. It's like the games we used to play when we were a little younger. You can say all manner of things. You can call yourself mother, father, but you are not mother at that stage. I'm saying this because we may think that this is not urgent business for us, but it is. Today, we are talking about the fourth industrial revolution. We are talking about robotics. We are talking about nanotechnology. But many times when I look at Africa, the Africa that I love, the Africa that you love, and you look at it and you are talking about nanotechnology, and we have had representation here about how MTL and the beautiful things that they do, and the fiber optics and all these optics that they keep talking about. But beyond Lilongwe, if you drive about 90 kilometers out of Lilongwe, or 90 kilometers out of Kinshasa, or 90 kilometers out of Bangui in Central African Republic, or 90 kilometers out of Libreville, Gabon, they live like they used to live in the 15th century. No electricity, no fiber optics. When you talk about fiber optics, they think you are talking about sisal fiber. When I go to most African countries, including Malawi, I have to struggle. Even when they give me at the hotel, they give me, this is your Wi-Fi password. I still have to twist my head and find the right spot in my room so that I don't shake, that I may be heard from Nairobi, Kenya. We must be able to compete with the world. And it can be done. And there are things that are beginning to happen in Africa that tells us that it can be done. I've traveled across Africa in the recent past, and I see things that suggest to me that things can be done. You know, I traveled to Rwanda, which is a small economy. And I see the Rwanda that I saw in 1994 and the Rwanda that I see now. You may say all you want, but let us give credit where it is due. Let us give credit where it is due. I see a clean Kigali. I see internet connectivity. I see a people with a purpose, because leadership is also at the center of effective utilization of resources. If you have men and women who know what ought to be done, they will lead you in the right direction. If what is happening in Rwanda can be replicated, Africa will begin to move in the right direction. But Rwanda must be seen in the context of Africa. Rwanda is small. It becomes Africa, then it becomes big. I've said at another time that when you are small and you are doing good things, Even when we praise you, if you are small and you are a goat, you can only grow to be a fat goat, not a cow. And a big portion of a small thing is still small. And it is not only in Rwanda that I've seen things happening. I've seen things happening even in Ghana. The economy of Ghana is now growing this year at 5.7%. It may not mean much, but at least that administration is saying we are going to have a factory in all the 290 districts of Ghana. Good thing. I've seen in Tanzania, even in Kenya, we now have one of the largest wind farms in Africa. Good thing. Africa is capable of realizing her potential. Even here in Malawi, you may say many things. Your per capita income is not anything to write home about. I know the levels of poverty, like in most African countries, are high. I know your agriculture is suffering. But imagine to yourself if Malawi were to choose to be the fulcrum of SADC. Imagine if Malawi were to focus on tourism. What don't you have? The cleanest is Lake Malawi. The cleanest lake on earth is Lake Malawi. When I tell people at home I'm now eating one of the best fish on earth called chambo, they have not heard of it. Have you marketed chambo so that it becomes famous? Why is McDonald's mere potatoes? Potatoes famous, and why is chambo famous? Can chambo be replicated and franchised to be produced in the entire Africa as a Malawian product? Can't it? It can, but it requires leadership. Men and women in position of authority that see, what do we have? What do we have? And God says, if allow me to be spiritual about this, I'm not going to have an altar call. But I remember that day. It was in the morning, about 3,000 years ago. A man who, when confronted by God himself, said, I cannot even speak. Says, but am I not the God who creates mouths and tongues? And he was told to go and liberate the Israelites from Egypt. He says, what shall I tell them? He was told, what do you have in your hands? What do you have? Because we are in the Egypt of poverty. We need to be liberated. We are in the Egypt of poverty. We need to be liberated. What do we have in our hand? We must ask each country what they have in their hands. When I go to South Africa, what do they have in their hands apart from the human resource? They have gold. That is what they must cast down. When you go to Namibia, what do they have in their hands? They have diamond. That is what they must cast down. When you go to Angola, what do they have in their hand? They have oil. That is what they must cast down. When you go to Lesotho, what do they have in their hand? They have water which they can sell to South Africa. That is what they must cast down. When you go to Eswatini, what do they have? They have farms and the reed dance. That is what they must cast down. When you go to Mozambique, they have fish. That is what they must cast down. When you go to Zimbabwe, what don't they have? They even have uranium and farms. That is what they must cast down. When you go to Zambia, what must they cast down? They must cast down copper. When you come to Malawi, what do you have? You have graphite and you have chambo. That is what you must cast down. When you go to Tanzania, what must they cast down? They must cast down diamond. When you go to Equatorial Guinea, oil, they must cast down. When you go to Kenya, they must cast down something, oil and coffee. You go to Uganda, they must cast down something in Rwanda and Burundi, and you can go on to Nigeria, to Mauritania, to Togo, to Benin. We have something to cast down. But we need leaders. And you are the leaders. Don't look for leadership elsewhere. Don't look for leadership elsewhere. Political leadership is critical, but they are leaders. If the accountants of Malawi, 2,300, and your CEO tells me by the end of the year, those who are practicing without registration, we are to come and register. You will be 4,000 of you. If you speak with one voice, President Professor Wamutarika will summon you to the State House to ask you, guide me, intelligent men and women. But if you sit here in Mangochi as accountants, and then when you leave and you go out there, you begin to think like little tribes, then you will be manipulated like tribes. That is what we must do. In order to change our politics, we must only focus on the things that can benefit us. And I have no doubt in my mind that it can be done. It can be done. So what Africa do I see? I'm not a Jewish prophet, nor related to any one of them. I do not have the foresight of Moses or the eschatological vision of John the Evangelist. But I can see on the basis of the evidence before me that Africa can and will be great. Why do I say so when young Africans are trying to run away from Africa in order to avoid what they consider is tribal? Why do I say so when South Africans are sending away fellow Africans? Why do I see beauty in gloom? But is it not true that it's darkest before dawn? Is it not true, as the ladies here will attest to, that just before a bundle of joy is delivered, before when there is either a boy or a girl, that the greatest and the most intense pain is just before the delivery, when laughter replaces wailing. When the man who was sitting in the labor ward just before the pangs and bolted away when the pangs intensified after the delivery, he comes into the room and said, "Behold, I am a father now." Africa is in such a state, and it is we who love her who must remain here in Africa and work with our brethren from outside of the continent, so that in future we can celebrate and be at the dinner table. I've said for a long time that the dinner table, particularly in this world, is not one at which you are allowed. I do not know, as I want to conclude, whether you have seen how the world operates. The United Nations organization will be meeting this week in New York, New York. All countries and their leaders will be given an opportunity to speak for a few minutes. When most African countries will be speaking and you look at the audience, there will be very few. But when the President of the United States of America speaks, whether you like him or not, people will be there. He or she who has food even when he smiles or sneers, it means the same thing. You must laugh because he can dish out food. When the leaders of Europe will be there, it will be, oh, everybody will be there. But when my good and learned friend, Professor Peter Wamutarika, will be speaking, a few Africans and a few others will be there, or may be there. It tells you that we are lightweights in the world. When the real decisions are being made, they now reduce it from 100 plus countries into what is called the Security Council. And in the Security Council, Africans do not have a permanent seat. You have a rotational membership. And in the Security Council, only 5 countries which matter have a veto. In other words, all the countries of the world can say many things, they can vote many times, but Russia has a card which they come with and they say veto, and all your votes are neutralized. Useless. That is where Africa is. When meetings are called, they have another level of meetings called the G20. G20 nowadays, you find the president of South Africa, I think, occasionally the chairman of the African Union, President Sisi will be there. But the real meeting is the G7. At the G7, they will invite a few Africans, and one of the things that you normally see at the G7, the African leaders who are invited will be at the photo when they start. Once the photo has been taken, you will never see them again. At all. Why? Because in the scheme of things, Africa does not matter. That is why aspiration number 7 of Agenda 2063 says, where Africa will be strong and will be an integral part of international affairs. I look forward to that day. I look forward to the day when Nigeria will rise, because the day Nigeria rises, Africa rises. Because 1 in every 5 African is Nigerian. That is how big Nigeria is. It cannot be ignored. The day Congo rises, Africa rises. It can happen, and I see it happening. But it's not only there where we are weak. Africa has 33 currencies. I was here 3 years ago, and when I was traveling here, I remembered I had some kwacha, 20 kwacha, which amounted to about 400 kwacha, with the portrait of your great Chitembwe, I think. Chilembe. So I came with my currency. And yesterday, as I sat in Blantyre, having consumed chambo, I now said that I must thank the lady who had served me. And I produce my 20 chilembe, and she tells me very politely, this is no longer legal tender. So I'm going back to Kenya with my 20 chilembe as museum pieces. I say this because even our currencies do not make sense outside of the country. When I have my shillings, even if they are hundreds of thousands, and it was not lost on me yesterday as I entered the Chileka airport and I looked at the bureau at the airport, there was exchange rate for the dollar, there was exchange rate for the euro, there was exchange rate for the British pound, there was exchange rate for the rand. Kenya was there, but it was blank. There was no Naira. In other words, we have 33 currencies, and all of them can never be described as hard currency. They are all soft currencies, because the opposite of hard must be soft. So you can see that and that is why it makes me happy when I see the economic community of West African states now meeting and say, by the year 2020, we are going to have a currency called the Icam. That is a good beginning. That is why I'm joyed when I see the African countries meeting in Kigali in Rwanda, and they come together and they said, we have Africa Continental Free Trade Area. I'm happy. I'm happy because I can begin to see that East African community is making strides. I'm happy because I can see ECOWAS is making strides. I'm happy because I can see COMESA is making strides. I am happy because I can see SADC is making strides. But we must tell South Africa, in no uncertain terms, Africans will come to South Africa and must be allowed, to whom that which much is given, much is expected. Africa, South Africa, what didn't Africa sacrifice? What didn't Tanzania sacrifice? What did Zambia sacrifice? What did Mozambique not sacrifice? What did other countries in the neighborhood, including Nigeria, not sacrifice for the people of South Africa? How is it that you have such short and selective memories that only after 25 years you now forget who your real enemies are, and it is only your fellow Africans? How is it that you South Africans now think that the whole five-star meal are the crumbs under the table, while the real dinner is on the table where caviar and choice one is being consumed in copious quantities? It is our duty to remind them. We understand their history. We understand where they come from. But it pains me when a South African taxi driver thinks that a Malawian doctor is taking his job. It cannot be true. It cannot be true. When a South African common trader thinks that a Malawian accountant is taking his job, it cannot be true. The joy of South Africa is that they are getting African talent which they have not borne the burden of training for free, paying their taxes. South Africa, you are the anchor in SADC, anchor SADC, so that SADC can be great. We think that if we move in that direction, Africa will be great. But let me conclude by telling us this. You know, when you want to win lottery, you must buy the ticket. No matter how spiritual you are, and I know some of you are very spiritual, if you want to win the lottery and you don't buy the ticket, and you go to your prophet, and there is no shortage of prophets in Africa, and the prophet now tells you to pray and fast, you will never win the lottery. Africa must buy the lottery of economic development. In other words, we must begin to do things that are right. In agriculture, we must continue and we must begin to practice sound agriculture. In mining, we must invest in mining. In the area of mobile telephony, we must begin to invest in mobile telephony. In all sectors, we must begin to participate. It is only those who participate who win the race. Spectators don't win the race. No, and unless it is here in Malawi, spectators don't win the race. It is only those who are on the field who score. Africans must now go into the field. They must play. Sometimes they will not score, but we must keep on playing. Because when we keep on playing, we will score someday. And it can be done. And lastly, let us remind ourselves that Africa has always been hovering around the dinner table of human civilization. Unfortunately, we have always been hovering around. The best we have been at the dinner table of human civilization is when we are waiters, waiting to serve others. It is good to be a waiter, but for how long shall we be waiters at the dinner table of human civilization? Because the last time I checked, we are either waiters or we were the food itself to be consumed. Time has come that we must now be the diners who are being fed and who are being waited on. You can do it, we must do it, and together Africa will be great. God bless.